AITAH for being disgusted and just saying okay when my fiancé broke up with me? I never saw it coming, not the way it ended. And certainly not how it ended. Looking back, maybe the signs were there. Subtle but present. The way Alex would brush off my questions. The weird tension that built between us. The moments when I thought I understood him and then realized I didn't at all. Still, it all seemed like a gradual shift until it wasn't. We met at a friend's party in 2020. I wasn't even supposed to be there. It was one of those random invites from a college friend who I hadn't seen in years. But it turned out to be one of those life-altering events. At least for a while. Alex had just finished his PhD in economics. And we clicked immediately. He was charming, smart, funny, all the things that made me feel like I was with someone truly special. It felt like fate. Like all the puzzle pieces of my life finally clicked into place. At the time, I had just finished my master's degree in media sciences. I had considered pursuing a PhD too. But something inside me told me I didn't need that extra step. I wanted to work, to jump into my career and make something of myself. Alex was the academic, the intellectual with big dreams of changing the world through data and policy. I loved that about him. He was driven. And it felt like our paths, though different, complemented each other. He supported my decision to work instead of continuing my studies. Or so I thought. In those early days, it seemed like we were building a future together. One where both our ambitions had space to thrive. We moved in together after about a year. Our apartment was small but cozy. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood near the university where Alex worked. It felt like our sanctuary. We painted the walls a deep green. A color I loved because it made the space feel calm, earthy, and alive. It was our home, or so I thought. Things were good, really good, for the first couple of years. We had a solid routine. I worked long hours at a media agency, and Alex spent most of his time at the university, lecturing and working on his research. When we weren't working, we would unwind together, binge-watching Netflix shows or cooking elaborate dinners on weekends. We had friends over occasionally, and I made an effort to integrate myself into his social circle. His friends were kind, though most of them were academics like him, and I sometimes felt like an outsider in their conversations. But Alex always made me feel included, reminding me that I was smart and capable, even if my path wasn't as academic as his. When Alex proposed, it felt like the natural next step. We were on the same page about almost everything, or so I thought. He wasn't a flashy guy. So the proposal was simple. Private. Just the two of us. I said yes, of course. In that moment, everything felt right. But things started to change after he finished his doctorate. It wasn't immediate. More like a slow unraveling. Like a loose thread you don't notice until it's pulled too far. He got a job at the university. Which was great. But the dynamic between us shifted. It was subtle at first. Small things like the way he looked at our apartment with a hint of disdain. Or the way he brushed off my questions about his day with a curt. It was fine. I chalked it up to the stress of starting a new job. Figuring he just needed time to adjust. Then, the complaints started. He didn't like the green walls anymore. He wanted to paint them white. It's too dark in here, he said one evening, out of nowhere, when I asked why he suddenly wanted to repaint. He snapped. For fuck's sake, just forget it. And that was it. No discussion. No further explanation. I thought maybe he was just stressed. But the green walls stayed. And the tension between us lingered. I tried to be patient. To give him space. But his irritability only grew. He started criticizing small things. Things that hadn't bothered him before. One evening, I was lying on the couch with a blanket over my head because I had cramps. He walked in and snapped. You're just sitting there watching Netflix while I'm working. The house was spotless. I had finished my work for the day. I was just trying to relax. When I asked him what was wrong, he muttered, forget it, it's not a big deal. But I could feel the tension radiating off him. This became our new normal, me walking on eggshells, trying to figure out what had changed, and him refusing to communicate. Every attempt I made to talk was met with resistance. I'm fine, he'd say, his voice tight, but the way he avoided eye contact told me otherwise. He seemed angry all the time. And I couldn't figure out why. Was it something I did? Was it work? Was he unhappy with me? I didn't know how to fix it because I didn't know what was broken. There were moments when things seemed normal again, when we'd have a good day or share a laugh over something silly. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between, and the air between us felt heavier with each passing week. I found myself pulling back, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know what else to do. When he snapped at me for something trivial, I started responding with silence. It seemed like no matter what I said, it would only make things worse. So, I gave him space. When he got upset, I let it go. When he said we should repaint the walls or change something about the apartment, I'd nod and say we could talk about it later. But, later, never came. There was one weekend when I decided to visit my parents for a few days. I thought maybe the space would help him relax. That he just needed some time alone to decompress. I told him about my plans, thinking he'd appreciate the break. Instead, he got upset again. "Why are you going to help them when we need to work on this place?" he snapped. His tone was cold, accusatory, like I was abandoning him. But he had never mentioned wanting to renovate. Never brought it up until that moment. I was starting to realize that nothing I did would be right in his eyes anymore. Every action, every decision, felt like a trigger for his frustration, even if I didn't understand why. As the weeks dragged on, the distance between us grew like an invisible wall, each day adding another brick that neither of us acknowledged. It was strange because we were still technically living our lives together. But emotionally, it felt like I was living with a stranger. The moments of laughter, of ease, the little things that made us feel connected, they were all slipping away. I wanted to be understanding. I wanted to believe that whatever was going on with Alex, it was just temporary stress. Maybe it was the adjustment to his new job. Or maybe there were pressures at the university that he wasn't telling me about. It made sense that after finishing his PhD, life would feel a little different. A little heavier. But that didn't explain why he had started treating me like I was part of the problem. The complaints became more frequent. And they were about the most trivial things. Things that never used to bother him. One evening, I was folding laundry in the bedroom when he walked in and frowned at the clothes. He didn't say anything at first. Just watched me for a moment with that look of disapproval on his face. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "Do you always have to fold them like that?" he muttered. I paused, caught off guard. "Like what?" I asked, genuinely confused. I had always folded the laundry this way, and he had never once mentioned it. But now, apparently, even this was a problem. "Never mind," he snapped, brushing past me to sit on the bed. "It's not important." But it was important. Not the laundry itself, but the fact that everything I did seemed to irritate him. He never explained why, never talked to me about what was really going on. Instead, he let these small frustrations build up until they spilled over into anger that had no clear source. I could feel his resentment growing. But every time I tried to talk to him, he shut me down. There were moments when I'd catch him staring at the apartment, his eyes scanning the room like he was cataloging everything he hated about it. The green walls he had once helped me paint were now apparently offensive to him. "This place is so dark," he'd mumble under his breath. Or, "Why did we ever pick this color?" It was like the life we had built together, the space we had created, was suddenly unbearable for him. And it wasn't just the apartment. It was me, too. He started making passive-aggressive comments about my job, as if the fact that I enjoyed my work somehow bothered him. One night, after a particularly long day at the agency, I came home excited to tell him about a project I was leading. I had landed a big client, and it was a moment I was proud of. But when I told him, instead of being happy for me, he just shrugged. "Well, I guess someone has to pay the bills," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a joke, it was a jab. A little dig at the fact that I was the one bringing in more money. He had never said anything like that before. But now it was becoming a theme, this resentment that I hadn't noticed until it was staring me in the face. I started to question everything. Had I been pushing too hard? Was I unintentionally making him feel inadequate? I never thought about our financial situation as a competition. I was proud of him for following his passion, for pursuing his academic career, even if it didn't pay much at the time. To me, it wasn't about money, it was about us building a life together, where we supported each other in whatever way we could. But apparently, he saw it differently. He saw me as controlling, as if I was using my income to hold something over him, even though I had never said or implied anything of the sort. It wasn't just the money, though. He resented me for not pursuing a PhD. That, too, had come out of nowhere. One day, out of the blue, he made a snide comment about how I was wasting my potential by not going back to school. "You could have done so much more," he said, "but I guess you're happy with your little job." His words stung, not because I believed them, but because they revealed how little he understood me. I didn't want a PhD. I had made that decision for myself, and I was happy with it. But in his mind, my choice was just another reason to resent me. Every conversation seemed to spiral into some unspoken argument, some tension I couldn't unravel. I found myself withdrawing, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to approach him anymore. It was like walking into a minefield, never knowing what would set him off. Then there was the incident with the blanket. I was curled up on the couch one afternoon, nursing the worst cramps I'd had in months, just trying to get through the day. The house was clean, my work was done, and all I wanted was to relax for a bit before starting dinner. But when Alex came home and saw me lying there, he exploded. "Do you ever do anything besides sit on that couch?" he snapped, his voice sharp and accusing. I blinked, confused and hurt. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The house is clean, and I've finished my work. I just needed to rest for a bit." He waved me off. "Forget it, it's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. Every comment he made chipped away at me, piece by piece, until I didn't even recognize the relationship we once had. I couldn't understand why everything I did seemed to irritate him, why the life we had built together now felt like a burden to him. I started spending more time away from the apartment, visiting my parents or staying late at work just to avoid the tension. But even that wasn't enough. One weekend, I told him I was going to help my parents with some repairs at their house. I thought the space would do us both some good, give him time to relax and clear his head. But instead, he got angry. "Why are you running off to help them when we need to work on this place?" he snapped, as if I had betrayed him by leaving for a few days. It felt like there was no winning. No matter what I did, it was wrong. If I stayed, I was in the way. If I left, I was abandoning him. The walls were closing in, and I was suffocating under the weight of his resentment. At this point, I knew something was deeply wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. Every attempt to talk, to communicate, was met with defensiveness or anger. He refused to open up, and I was left trying to piece together what had gone so horribly wrong. And then, of course, Monday happened. Monday morning felt like any other day. I got up, got ready for work, and left the apartment before Alex even stirred. We hadn't really spoken over the weekend. Not that it was anything out of the ordinary at this point. We had settled into this uncomfortable silence, where neither of us addressed the growing tension between us. But it hovered there, thick and suffocating, like the air before a storm. By noon, I was in the middle of a project at work when I saw his text. "We need to talk." There it was, the thing I had been expecting but never fully preparing for. My heart sank, not out of shock, but from the dull weight of inevitability. I stared at the message, knowing exactly what was coming. He was finally going to break up with me. A small part of me felt relieved. It had been months of feeling like I was stuck in a relationship with a ticking time bomb. Another part of me, the part still holding onto the past, was sad that it had come to this. When I got home that evening, Alex was already sitting on the couch, waiting. He didn't even let me take off my jacket before he launched into it. "I want to break up," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact, as if he was delivering a business decision instead of ending a 4-year relationship. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, as he unleashed a verbal avalanche I wasn't fully prepared for. It was like he had been storing up every resentment, every frustration, every small annoyance, and now it all came spilling out in a single, breathless rant. He resented me, he said. He resented me for not pursuing my PhD, for not chasing after the academic life he had chosen. I had so much potential, according to him, and I was wasting it in a mediocre career, instead of becoming something greater. He told me he had hated the fact that, because I made more money, he felt like I held financial control over him, even though I had never once made him feel that way. I'd never said or implied that I had control over our finances. He had imposed that belief on himself. And apparently, it had eaten away at him. I felt like you had the final say on everything, just because you were the one earning more, he said, his words dripping with bitterness. I couldn't stand it. I was stunned. I had never thought of our finances in those terms. Yes, I earned more, but I had always viewed our money as shared, as something we both contributed to in different ways. I wasn't keeping score, but apparently, he was. He went on, talking about how he hated everything about our apartment, the green walls, the couch, the furniture, even the damn crockpot we used to make our Sunday dinners together was on his list of grievances. Everything about this place feels wrong, he muttered, staring at the floor. Then came the kicker. He told me that a few years ago, he had been accepted into a better PhD program, one that would have taken him overseas. He had turned it down. He said, because I had already started my job here, and he didn't want to uproot our life. But he never told me any of this, not about the program, not about the offer, not about his decision to stay. Now, he was saying he resented me for it, that he blamed me for holding him back, even though I had never asked him to make that choice. I didn't even know it was on the table. I could have been thriving in that program, he said, his voice low and full of regret. But instead, I stayed here, for you, and now look at me. I just stood there, absorbing it all. I had expected the breakup, but I hadn't expected this tirade. This list of every single thing he hated about our life together. It was like he had rewritten the entire story of our relationship in his head, casting me as the villain who had ruined his dreams. None of it felt real. None of it felt like the truth. He wasn't done. He said he hated that all his friends liked me, that they never let him vent about me, never let him complain because they thought I was so great. It's like they're on your side all the time, he said, his voice rising. I couldn't even talk to them about how much I hated this relationship. And then, just like that, he said, I'm done. I don't know what I was supposed to feel in that moment. Sad? Angry? Relieved? Maybe I felt all of it. But mostly, I just felt disgusted. Disgusted by the way he had been harboring all of this resentment without ever telling me. Disgusted by the way he twisted everything to make me the reason for his unhappiness. Disgusted by the fact that he didn't have the decency to talk to me about any of this before it boiled over into a breakup. I looked at him, and I must have had some kind of expression on my face, disbelief, disgust, something, because he immediately reacted to it. That's it? That's all you have to say? He snapped. After 4 years, all you can say is, okay. I hadn't realized I had said it out loud, but apparently, I had. Okay. I had muttered when he said he was done. And that was all I had left to give. He was furious. This is exactly what I mean, he shouted, getting up from the couch. You're just cold. You don't care at all. We've been together for 4 years. And all you have to say is, okay. That's it? I just stared at him. Too exhausted to fight. Too disgusted to care. Do you want to stay here while you figure out where to go? I asked, my voice calm despite the storm that was raging in the room. I didn't want to argue with him. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. He looked at me like I had slapped him. Typical, he sneered. Of course you're holding the apartment over me. I didn't respond. What was there to say? He had already decided I was the villain in his story. Anything I said would only fuel his anger. So I left. I grabbed my keys, walked out the door, and went to my parents' house. I needed space. And clearly, so did he. The days following the breakup were a blur of numbness and strange clarity. I wasn't crying, which was surprising to me. There were no angry outbursts. No regret-filled messages to Alex. I wasn't heartbroken in the way I had thought I might be. Instead, there was this dull, quiet acceptance, a kind of resignation that this was bound to happen. even if the way it unfolded was jarring. I spent that first night at my parents' house. They didn't press me with questions, which I was grateful for. My mom made me tea, and my dad sat with me in silence, watching TV. It was exactly what I needed, just space to exist without having to explain myself. I think they knew, from the look on my face, that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. The next morning, my dad approached me while I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into my tea. He didn't say anything at first, just sat across from me. After a long pause, he asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" I didn't really know where to start. How do you sum up months of tension, of unraveling, of a relationship that had deteriorated so quietly and yet so dramatically all at once? But I tried. I told him about how Alex had been distant for months, how everything seemed to irritate him, and how he finally exploded during the breakup with a laundry list of resentments I didn't even know he had been harboring. My dad listened patiently, nodding along as I spoke, and when I finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You can't change how he feels," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But you also can't take responsibility for choices he made without telling you." That hit me hard. I had been replaying Alex's words over and over in my head, trying to figure out if there was some truth to them, if I had, in fact, somehow held him back, or if I had unknowingly controlled his life in ways he resented. But my dad's words gave me a new perspective. Alex had made his choices, whether it was staying for a job or turning down opportunities, and he had never discussed those choices with me. He had internalized his resentment and let it fester until it blew up in both of our faces. "He's an adult," my dad added. "He could have talked to you about it at any time." "He didn't." I nodded, feeling the weight of my dad's words sink in. It wasn't my fault. Alex had chosen to keep things from me. He had chosen to blame me for decisions I wasn't even aware of. And now, I was left with the aftermath of his unresolved anger. Over the next few days, I started to unravel the tangled mess of emotions Alex had left me with. It was like peeling back layers, each one revealing something I hadn't fully realized about our relationship. I began to see how much of myself I had given to him, to us, without even questioning whether I was getting anything back. It wasn't that I had been unhappy. I genuinely loved Alex, and I had thought we were building something together. But as I reflected on the past few months, I realized how much of myself I had sacrificed in the process. I had bent over backward trying to make things easier for him, trying to support him through his PhD, through his job, through everything. I had let his frustrations become my own, constantly trying to find ways to fix things that weren't my responsibility to fix. And that was the part that stung the most. I had spent so much energy trying to be a good partner, to be understanding and patient, that I had lost sight of the fact that he wasn't giving me the same in return. He hadn't been there for me in the way I had been there for him. Instead, he had been quietly resenting me for things I didn't even know were problems. A few days after the breakup, I decided to reach out to our landlord. I needed to figure out what my options were regarding the apartment. Could I afford to stay there on my own? What would happen if Alex moved out? The thought of going back there, to the place that now felt like a graveyard of broken promises, was daunting, but I had to face it sooner or later. The landlord was surprisingly kind about the whole thing. He told me that, as long as I could cover the rent, there was no issue with Alex leaving the lease. I had been paying more of the bills anyway, so financially, I could handle it. It was the emotional weight of the place that I wasn't sure I could carry. But I wasn't ready to let go of the apartment just yet. It was still my home, even if Alex had poisoned it with his resentment. After sorting out the logistics, I went back to the apartment one evening, bracing myself for what I knew would be a difficult return. The moment I walked in, the silence hit me like a ton of bricks. Everything felt heavy, the walls, the furniture, even the air. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something, to make a decision about what would come next. The green walls, once comforting and earthy, now seemed oppressive. The couch where we used to curl up together felt foreign. Everything in the apartment was a reminder of the life we had shared, a life that no longer existed. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. Before I finally exhaled and walked to the bedroom, Alex had already started moving his things out. His closet, once crammed with clothes and shoes, was now half empty. The sight of it was strangely liberating. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The apartment wasn't fully mine yet, but it was starting to feel like it could be. I could reclaim this space, piece by piece, and make it my own again. Over the next few days, I slowly began the process of detangling myself from Alex, emotionally, financially, and physically. I canceled the subscriptions we had shared, switched the utilities into my name, and started reorganizing the apartment. It was small, incremental changes, but each one felt like a step toward reclaiming my independence. One evening, while scrolling through Instagram, I came across a post from a friend who had recently adopted a cat. It made me pause, and for the first time, I thought seriously about getting one. Alex had always been allergic, so the idea of having a pet was never on the table. But now, with him gone, it seemed like a small act of rebellion, a way to take back control of my life in a way that was entirely mine. I smiled at the thought. Maybe a cat wouldn't solve all my problems, but it felt like the start of something new, something that was just for me. It's funny how quickly life can feel both foreign and familiar at the same time. After Alex moved out, there was this bizarre sensation of both freedom and emptiness in the apartment. The space that had once been filled with the subtle tension between us was now just quiet, unsettlingly quiet. But that quiet also offered something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. It started with small changes. The first thing I did was take down the painting we had hung together in the living room. The one we both liked when we first moved in but that Alex had grown to resent. It was abstract, with bold strokes of deep greens and blues, and I used to love the way it complemented the green walls. But now, all it reminded me of was his complaints about how dark and suffocating the place felt. So, I took it down. I didn't throw it away, but I tucked it in the back of the closet, out of sight. It felt good to remove that piece of our shared history. A small but significant act of reclaiming the space. I wasn't in a rush to overhaul the apartment. There were too many memories tied to it, and I needed to process those before making any big decisions, but I did start to gradually reshape it. I brought in more plants. Something I had always wanted to do but never got around to because Alex didn't like the clutter. Now, with him gone, I filled the windowsills with ferns and succulents, adding a sense of life back into the rooms. It made the apartment feel fresh again, like it was coming alive just as I was. The green walls still stood, and I had mixed feelings about them. They had been our joint decision when we first moved in, something we'd both agreed would make the space cozy and earthy. But now, every time I looked at them, all I could hear were his complaints about how they made the place too dark. For weeks, I debated repainting them, imagining the fresh, clean slate of white or soft gray that would brighten the rooms. But something stopped me from making the change. As much as Alex had come to hate the color, I still loved it. It wasn't the walls that had made our relationship deteriorate, it was us. Repainting them felt like giving in to his criticisms, like erasing my taste to accommodate his unhappiness, even though he was no longer around. So, I left them as they were. The walls could stay green. They were mine now, not his. As the weeks passed, I found myself slowly shedding the weight of Alex's presence. Not just in the apartment, but in my mind. The mental gymnastics I had been doing for months. Trying to figure out how to keep him happy. How to walk the fine line between giving him space and being supportive. All of that began to fade. I realized just how much of myself I had been giving away. How much of my own energy had been spent trying to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. And with that realization came a strange, liberating sense of relief. I didn't have to do that anymore. I didn't have to play the guessing game of what would or wouldn't set him off. I didn't have to worry about whether I was making him feel inadequate or whether I was doing enough to keep the peace. That constant, underlying tension was gone, and in its place was a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. One weekend, I invited a couple of close friends over. They had been my support system through the breakup, checking in on me, offering to help with anything I needed. But I had kept them at arm's length for a while. I wasn't ready to dive into long conversations about what had happened. And they respected that. But now, I felt like I was ready to start letting people back in. To show them that I was okay, that I was more than okay. We spent the afternoon drinking wine, eating takeout, and laughing about everything and nothing. For the first time in what felt like forever. I wasn't preoccupied with Alex or the fallout of our relationship. I was just present. And it felt good. My friends complimented the plants. The way I had rearranged the furniture. The small touches I had added to make the apartment feel more like me. They asked if I had plans to redecorate. And I told them I wasn't sure. I wanted to take my time with it. To make changes that felt meaningful rather than rushed. And that was true, not just about the apartment, but about my life in general. After they left, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, staring at the space around me. It didn't feel like Alex's place anymore. It didn't even feel like our place. It was mine, and I liked that. I wasn't rushing to fill the void he had left. Because the truth was, the void didn't feel as big as I had expected. It wasn't a black hole sucking me in. It was just space. Space that I could fill with whatever I wanted. Or leave empty if that's what felt right. And then, one day, I got the cat. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. But it wasn't overly planned either. I had been thinking about it for a while. And after seeing a few adoption posts online, I decided to visit a local shelter. There was this little gray tabby with bright green eyes who immediately caught my attention. She was quiet but curious, sitting near the edge of her enclosure, watching everything with a calm intensity that made me feel like she understood more than she let on. When I reached out to pet her, she leaned into my hand, purring softly, and I knew I had found my new roommate. I brought her home that evening, and she settled in as if she had always belonged there. I named her Luna, and having her around brought a warmth to the apartment that I hadn't realized was missing. She followed me from room to room, curling up next to me on the couch or watching me as I watered the plants. Her quiet companionship was exactly what I needed, someone who was there, but who didn't demand anything from me, who was content just to be. As Luna and I settled into our new routine, I found myself thinking less and less about Alex. The things that had once triggered memories of him, the couch, the crockpot, even the green walls, now felt neutral, like they had been scrubbed clean of their association with him. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't sad. I had let go of the need to understand why he had resented me or why he had chosen to leave. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was still standing. Still here, still building a life that felt good and right for me. I hadn't fully healed yet. And I knew that. Healing wasn't a straight line, it was more like a spiral. Looping back on itself, with some days feeling harder than others. But I was okay with that. I was okay with taking my time. With not rushing to figure everything out. I was okay with the uncertainty. Because for the first time in a long time, I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. With Luna curled up on the couch beside me, the apartment finally felt like home again. It wasn't the same home I had shared with Alex, it was something new. Something entirely mine. The green walls stayed, but they no longer felt like a reminder of a shared decision. They were simply part of the space I had chosen to keep for myself. The furniture, the small plants lining the windowsills, the way Luna moved around as if she owned the place, all of it was starting to feel like a fresh beginning. A place where I could breathe and be. The weeks after adopting Luna flew by in a way that surprised me. Time moved differently when I wasn't constantly trying to manage someone else's mood or navigate the silent tension that had plagued my relationship with Alex. The weight I had been carrying around for months, trying to figure out what was wrong, what I could do better, had lifted. There was lightness in my life now. A kind of freedom I hadn't realized I was missing. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could focus on myself without feeling guilty. I took long walks, started cooking for fun instead of out of necessity, and even joined a yoga class. It was a way to reset my mind and body, to reconnect with who I was before I had become so wrapped up in the complexities of my relationship. I found joy in the simple things again, watering the plants, trying new recipes, or just lying on the floor with Luna, watching her swat at invisible dust particles. Life had slowed down, but in a way that felt intentional. not stagnant. One evening, while sitting on the balcony with a cup of tea, I realized something that had been bubbling under the surface for a while now. I wasn't just moving on from Alex, I was moving toward myself. The version of me that I had sidelined in the last months of our relationship. The one who had tried so hard to make everything work, was coming back to life. It wasn't about finding someone new or proving anything to anyone else. It was about rebuilding a relationship with myself, learning to trust my instincts again, and honoring the decisions I made for my own happiness. I reflected on all the ways I had bent to accommodate Alex's resentment. How I had internalized his criticisms without realizing it. The constant pressure to be more, to do more, had weighed on me more than I had acknowledged at the time. But now, as I sat there in the quiet of the evening, I could see it clearly. I hadn't been living for myself. I had been living for his approval, trying to smooth out the rough edges of our relationship without realizing that he had stopped contributing a long time ago. Letting go of that realization was both painful and liberating. I hadn't failed in our relationship. I had given it everything I had. And it still wasn't enough for him. But that didn't mean I wasn't enough. It just meant we weren't right for each other. And that was okay. It took time. But I started to embrace that truth, allowing myself the grace to move forward without carrying the burden of his unhappiness. As the weeks turned into months, I began to think about the future in ways I hadn't before. I wasn't rushing to figure out my next steps, but I was allowing myself to dream again. The breakup had given me space to reevaluate what I wanted out of life. Not just in terms of relationships, but in terms of my own personal growth. I started thinking about new goals, taking a cooking class, learning to play the piano, traveling more. Things I had pushed aside because they didn't fit into the mold of our shared life were suddenly back on the table. One day, I came across a travel blog that sparked something inside me. The writer talked about solo trips she had taken, exploring places on her own and the sense of independence and discovery that came with it. The idea stuck with me. I had always traveled with others, friends, family, and Alex. I had never even considered the idea of traveling alone. But now, the thought of it felt exciting. It was a challenge, a way to prove to myself that I could step outside of my comfort zone and experience the world on my own terms. I started planning a trip. Nothing too extravagant, just a long weekend in a nearby city I'd always wanted to visit. It wasn't about getting away from anything, it was about moving towards something new. The idea of spending time alone, exploring a place I'd never been before, felt like the next step in my journey of self-discovery. It wasn't just about seeing new sights, it was about proving to myself that I could stand on my own. That I didn't need anyone else to define my experiences. As I researched places to visit, hotels to stay in, and things to do, I felt a sense of anticipation that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't about escaping my life, it was about embracing it. I could feel the spark of excitement that had been dulled by months of uncertainty and emotional exhaustion reignite. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, truly living, and it felt incredible. Luna, of course, would stay with my parents for the weekend, and as I packed my bags for the trip, she watched me with her usual curiosity, as if sensing that something important was happening. And in a way, it was. This trip, as simple as it seemed on the surface, marked the beginning of a new chapter for me. It wasn't about running away from the past, it was about stepping boldly into the future. Knowing that I was enough, just as I was. The weekend getaway was everything I had hoped it would be. I spent my days wandering through art galleries, sipping coffee at quaint little cafes, and taking long walks along the waterfront. There was something incredibly freeing about being on my own, making decisions based on what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it. I wasn't rushing to fit anyone else's schedule or compromising on where to go. It was just me, in my own time, at my own pace. The trip wasn't life-changing in any dramatic way, but it was a reaffirmation of something I had known deep down all along. I didn't need someone else to make my life complete. I was whole on my own, and I had the power to create the life I wanted, without waiting for anyone else's permission. When I returned home, it felt like I had crossed a threshold. I wasn't the same person who had left just a few days ago. I had gained a sense of clarity, A deeper understanding of who I was and what I wanted. And while I didn't have all the answers, I knew that I was on the right path. I was moving forward, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Luna greeted me at the door, weaving between my legs as if to say, "Welcome back, this is where you belong." And she was right. This was where I belonged, in this new life I was building for myself. One step at a time. Months have passed since that Monday when everything changed. And in a way, it feels like a lifetime ago. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, it's all faded now into something quieter. Something I've made peace with. I never thought a breakup would lead me to the place I'm in now. A place where I'm content and hopeful about the future. But life has a funny way of unfolding in ways you don't expect. Looking back, I realize the breakup wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a new chapter I desperately needed. At the time, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. But what I've come to understand is that it gave me the space I needed to find myself again. It forced me to face the parts of me that had been buried beneath the weight of a relationship that was no longer serving me. Luna has become my constant companion. A quiet, calming presence that reminds me every day of how much joy there is in the simple things. Watching her sunbathe on the windowsill or chase a stray thread across the floor. I'm reminded that life doesn't have to be complicated to be fulfilling. There's a beauty in the ordinary, in the routines I've created for myself. And I'm learning to appreciate that in a way I never did before. The apartment has fully transformed. Not in drastic ways, but in ways that feel true to who I am now. The green walls stayed, but they're now adorned with new art, pieces I picked out on my own. Things that reflect the person I'm becoming. The space is brighter, more open, and it feels like a reflection of me, a work in progress. But one I'm proud of. As for Alex, I haven't heard from him in months. He moved out of my life as easily as he moved out of the apartment. And while there was a time when I wondered how he was doing, that curiosity has faded. I don't hold any resentment toward him anymore. We were both different people when we met. And we grew in different directions. I can see that now without bitterness. If anything, I'm grateful for the clarity that breakup brought me. It was painful, yes, but it was also a necessary push toward the life I'm building for myself. My solo trip ended up being the first of many. It was a small step, but it opened the door to a world of possibilities I hadn't considered before. I've started planning more trips, some alone, some with friends, because I've realized how much I love exploring on my own terms. It's not about running away or proving anything to anyone, it's about discovering the world and, in turn, discovering more about myself. I'm learning that I'm stronger, more capable, and more resilient than I ever gave myself credit for. Work has been fulfilling, too. I've thrown myself into new projects, taken on leadership roles, and even started mentoring younger colleagues. I find a sense of purpose in my career that I never felt the need to justify. I don't need anyone's approval or validation to know that I'm on the right path. Most importantly, I've learned to trust myself again. For so long, I doubted my instincts, questioned whether I was doing enough, being enough. But now, I see that I've always been enough. I don't need to mold myself to fit someone else's expectations. I don't need to lose myself in the process of making someone else happy. I am allowed to take up space, to have needs, and to live a life that makes me feel whole. I've also started therapy, something I had been hesitant about for years. It's helped me unpack not just the breakup, but the deeper patterns I've carried with me for a long time, patterns of putting others before myself, of seeking external validation, of being afraid to ask for what I need. Therapy has been a way to peel back the layers and get to the core of who I am. And while I'm still very much a work in progress, I feel more grounded than ever. There's still uncertainty ahead. I don't know exactly where my life is headed. And for the first time, that doesn't scare me. I've learned to embrace the unknown. To trust that I'll be okay no matter what happens. I don't need to have all the answers right now. I don't need a perfect plan. I just need to keep moving forward. One step at a time. Trusting that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. In the quiet moments, when Luna curls up next to me, or when I'm sipping tea on the balcony, watching the world go by, I feel a deep sense of peace. I didn't think I'd get here. Not so soon after everything fell apart. But here I am, standing on my own 2 feet. Feeling more like myself than I have in years. This isn't the life I thought I'd have. But it's mine. And that's enough.